I'm Dr. Alauna. I go by the trauma psychiatrist because I am the first and unfortunately the only trauma psychiatrist in America. And I coined that term about 7 years ago because God really put it in my heart that I needed to take my practice outside of the VA, outside of the veterans that I was treating, because I realized through my own traumas and through the watching and observing the national traumas that we all are experiencing traumatic things fairly regularly, right? And so as I began to strip back my own understanding, because that's not the way mental health and medicine regards trauma. Trauma has tended to be thought of as a sub-segment. When we think of trauma, we think of PTSD, and we typically think of like the very high bar. We don't usually think of ourselves as being traumatized, because when we think about trauma, we're like, oh, it has to be, you know, you have to be in the military. You have to go be blown up somewhere. And the reality is that that's actually not the definition of trauma. Trauma has to be defined on an individual basis by what does the person, the human, experience internally as painful enough that it changes the way they think about themselves, the world, and other people. And so when you begin to think about what things could be traumatic, I mean, let's list them. I see some of you all in the chat, so let's kind of just think through the experiences that you might find to be traumatic. I'm going to read some of them out loud as you all type them in. But as we think about what kind of things are experienced as trauma, what comes to mind for me was, right, COVID. That was actually going to be my first one, right? But sexual assault, heartbreak, denial in a relationship, your body going sideways on you and developing health, right? Workplace, the things that happen in our workspaces that cause us pain and invalidation, verbal abuse, someone speaking to you, talking to you in a destructive way. All of those are, someone in the chat, Tiff notes, caretakers, right? Caregiving trauma, having, not only, I don't know if we mean that in terms of taking care of other people, but that is traumatic. And then there's also the people that take care of us. When we're growing up, lots and lots of people have childhood trauma. And not that our families didn't love us. And some of us, our families did not, right? So when we start looking at the totality of things like COVID, which was a hugely traumatic experience for our entire world, and then we look at things like natural disasters, and now we're having unnatural disasters, right? Man-made and human disasters. And then we have gun violence, we have political chaos, we have disinformation, we have gender violence. We have so many spaces where things are happening that cause pain and trauma. And so as I began to think through what my role could be, and as we are talking about all of these things that we've gone through, there's a lot that does not get acknowledged. Financial trauma, right? Growing up in poverty, losing a job, having a banking or fraud or something happen in your accounts. Like, those are experiences that change the way you think about yourself, the world, and other people. And so they program your brain, right? So when I began to, one of the things that shifted me from being a prescriber and taking care of people one-on-one is that I began to recognize, one, the impact that it had on me to be trying to explain something new to each person, like in tiny windows, 30-minute windows. We're supposed to do all these things to help a person with their mental health and try to teach them about what they need, get the information, teach them about what they need to know for their brain, teach them about the medication. It was impossible, and it was incredibly stressful. And I began to recognize the wear and tear it was having on my body of hearing all of these traumatized stories, right? All of these things just in my regular job as treating PTSD in the VA. And my body began to malfunction. In 2017, I hit a wall. I had pain in my joints. My body was inflamed. I everything just seemed like it went sideways. And I heard a lot of you all talking about doing cleanses and detoxes and other things and starting to eat raw foods and really think about how what you're putting in impacts your health. And we have a tendency to think about how what we're putting in from a food nutrition standpoint, we're thinking about that physical element now, but now we also need to think about what we put into our brain, what we put into our psyche, the invisible part of ourselves. That is very real, but they've given us no attention and no education about these internal processes that all human beings share in common. So there's three things I really want to reinforce for you today, just to make sure that we build a groundwork for how we can work together later. The three things I really want you to appreciate is that grief is a normal and expected result of the painful experiences that we've been through over the last few years, especially when we talk about COVID, when we talk about the experience of living in America right now. It is traumatic. And so it should be expected that you will have some emotions and some roller coaster of emotions that we have to actually learn to deal with, right? If the things we don't talk about, it's not like they're not still affecting us, right? We have this tendency to get past stuff, and America's strategy is like forward. It's like always, don't look at it, just keep going. And even though that we've developed this remarkable resilience, I'm so thankful to be a black person, because I'm like, man, the culture of resilience that we have, it's a beautiful thing, but it's also not good for our health, okay? Being so mentally forward-thinking that we don't stop to process and really dig into what has happened and really allow ourselves to have that emotional experience of grief and processing it and examining it for what we do next. That's something that we haven't been taught. I know for many of you, you've been through a lot of school. How many hours of formal education did they give you about emotions? Type in the chat for me. How many formal hours of education about anger, sadness, how to process? Oh, zero. That's what I hear most of the time, right? It's zero. And so the one thing that you're using through your entire life, your emotions, which are, by the way, generated by your amygdala. That's my favorite part of the brain. So one of the things that makes my approach different is that when you work with me, you're going to learn about the internal workings of your brain. I don't prescribe any pills. I prescribe skills. I teach you ways of understanding what's happening inside of your brain, and then I give you skills to activate or recognize the impact of your biology on your thought process and how to examine that and change it. Because the beauty of it is your amygdala, which is the part of your brain that creates your emotions, and I'll type it in the chat in a moment, your amygdala creates them not based on any firm, grounded reality. It simply bases it on how you are interpreting the situation. Okay? And it creates those emotions, like most people have heard about the amygdala related to fear, like the fight, flight, freeze, stress response. But it does all of your emotions just as well as it does that fight, flight, and freeze. So happy, sad, type in the chat for me any emotion words that you can think of. Just off the top of your head, what comes to mind when I say emotions? What sensations or feelings, what language and vocabulary do we use when we're talking about emotions? Fear, love, happiness, sadness, energy and motion, right? Emotions are energy and motion. They are contagious. They impact other people around us, and they impact our internal state. Jealousy, irritation, euphoria, exactly. All of those are emotion words. Calm is also an emotion. Numb, detached, those are emotional states. So I say all of that to start the process of helping you recognize that every moment of the day, even when you're asleep, your brain is processing and creating emotions in that amygdala. And so just because people told you that you are not supposed to have emotions, or that women have too many, men are not supposed to have them, or whatever foolishness and emotional myths that were taught to you, either directly or indirectly through behaviors or implication, if they didn't teach you that your emotions come from your amygdala and they're created in proportion to what you believe about the situation, then they just didn't know. They taught you wrong. And we got zero formal education about it, so I'm just here to correct and put in the information that will help you as you begin to feel and become aware of those internal emotional states. So, for one, we're going to recognize that being aware of our emotions is part of what helps us process grief. And we should be grieving because there's a lot of things going on that we should be feeling some intense emotions about. The question becomes, how do we take this, process it, and turn it into something healthy that brings us a better society, a better personal experience, and a better mental health status? The second thing I want to reinforce for you is that these health challenges that we have are so traumatic that they, as you think about detoxing your body, also think about detoxing your mind. I want you to consider, how much time do I spend watching videos that arouse an internal negative experience in me? How much, when I'm watching my streaming shows or my television programs, am I watching things that are so violent that they cause me to, in some ways, think more violently, right? Because right now we have a serious epidemic of a global mental health crisis of violence. People acting out on each other, people at kind of at the end of their rope, and then it doesn't take much to push them over to putting hands on or bullets towards other people, right? And so part of what we have to recognize in that is that if we don't address what we're putting into our bodies, psychologically and physically, then we will not be aware of how it impacts our internal experience and what comes out of our mouth, what comes out of our body, what posture we take towards our friends and our families. It's important to understand that our brain is like a sponge, and we have parts of our brain that, and for one, we have a part called mirror neurons. And those parts of our brain absorb and pick up on information around us in the environment. And then under stress especially, it kicks out behaviors and it kicks out thought processes that are just reflections of what we've absorbed from our environment. So these are just some of the brain systems that I teach about in my program called the Trauma Cure, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later on in our session. But the third thing is when you're dealing with these with financial difficulties, I want you to also remember that that can be traumatic, and that it's okay for us to be able to process that, hey, it's difficult when you don't have enough money to pay for your medications. You don't have enough money to see your doctors and your caregiving team the way you need to. When you don't have the money to purchase the type of health regimen and things that you feel like you need. These are all parts of what we have to do internal work on. So I love the work that you all are doing here, just coming into this meeting, because you're giving intention towards rebuilding something that they handed us broken. Anybody on this call, we're born into a world that was dysfunctional when we got here, right? And we're trying to become functional in a space that is inherently dysfunctional, right? So in order to do that, we need more information. In my opinion, the information is the most important medication for us healing ourselves from a mental health and a trauma recovery standpoint. So I'm going to pause there.